We are blessed by having a longtime missionary, writer, historian, as I mentioned before, the author of 18 books. And it's like to welcome, a warm BenDavid welcome to Kelvin.
Thank you.
Thank you for
Okay, thank you. Well, thank you, Rob, and thank you, folks. I'm going to start off by giving a little bit of a background because there is an orange connection with me. There's one with Lexi as well, because the House of Orange from the Netherlands, but that's not the orange connection. To get to the orange connection, there's just been an introduction, because you don't know me from a bar of soap, as we'd say down where I come from. You know Olivia, he's been here, but you don't know me, so perhaps you should get to know a little bit about who I am. I came from Western Australia, and like most Australians, I'm a mixed bag, and like most Americans, probably, you're a mixed bag as well. Mostly Anglo, but I'm also part Aboriginal. My great-grandmother was an Aboriginal lady, but we didn't grow up with that understanding of our Indigenous heritage. As a young boy of about 5, I became interested in matters concerning Israel, and that came because I wanted to know why family members were members of the Australian Armed Forces who served in the Middle East. Now, as distinct to the United States, Australia entered into the war at the very beginning, First World War, Second World War, and on both occasions Australian soldiers were serving in the Middle East, in Egypt, the land of Israel, and all around that region. So I had family members who were there during both World Wars. So somebody was killed in the First World War, who's buried in the Middle East, and 2 relatives who died in the Second World War who are also buried in the Middle East. So it's part of our DNA to have family members who served in the Middle East. And so all Australians and New Zealanders will know names of places in the Middle East, and because we learn about it every year when we have our Anzac or memorial service. I wanted to know why my family members were there. I wanted to know why Australians were in the Middle East. Now, I'm only 5 years of age. I've got no Jewish background and no Christian background either. And as a result of that, I began to ask lots of questions and read lots of books. By the age of 10, I was reading an encyclopedia of the Second World War, and a very, very informative encyclopedia. And in that book, I came across a whole section called Hitler's Final Solution to the Jewish Problem. Now, I'm 10 years of age, and I'm seeing graphic photographs, and they stuck in my mind, and they're still stuck there until today. So a question now came in, who are these Jewish people, and why are they being treated like this? Now, you have to realise that when I grew up, Western Australia had a population of just over 1 million. It's 3 million now. Half of those lived in Perth. Western Australia is the size of India or the size of California and Texas put together. Gives you an idea of how remote and sparsely populated we were. And I lived out in the bush, and an Israeli family came to live on a farm out there in the bush, and the kids went to the same primary school as me. And so look at the law of averages. What chance would you have of that happening? And there's a kid in the same school, collected postage stamps, got the postage stamps of Israel, and so my interest in Israel continued to grow. Israel, the Jewish people. Things happened relating to the Six-Day War when I was 10 years of age. That also had a big impact upon me. Realising I'm not from a Jewish background, I'm not from a Christian background either. At the age of 11, I went into our local newsagent. Our local town was about 18 miles away. I went in to buy a magazine, sporting magazine, Aussie rules football, cricket, okay, you know all about that, don't you? And instead, there was a book in the news agency called Treblinka. Treblinka was the second most notorious of the death camps, where 700,000 Jewish people were murdered. I bought that book instead of my sporting magazine. Now, what 11-year-old kid with no Jewish background, Christian background would do that? So something was happening inside my life, which I was completely oblivious. I'll give you a hint. It's to do with a man. Oh, sorry, not a man. Excuse me. I need some water up here, please. Right? Thank you very much. It's all connected to the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. Of course, I didn't know about the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob at the time. Cut a long story short, I pulled out of university, so I don't even have a BA to my name. I pulled out before I left because I wanted to go to Israel because I knew I'd find the answer to life in Israel. I was searching. I went there in 1979 to a kibbutz called Mayan Baruch in the very north of Israel. And I was searching to the degree that I realised I would find the answer in Israel. And at one stage, I was going to convert to Judaism. not because I was interested in Judaism, I wasn't, but because I wanted to become a soldier in the Israeli army. In that period of time in 1979, while I was a very, very hedonistic and wild volunteer, a group came from Orange County, from a particular, what was the name of the Calvary Chapel? And I can't remember which Calvary Chapel it was. It was a group of them, and they were Christians. And I didn't really like Christians, to be frank with you. I won't go into all the details. Why? Being a hedonistic young man, Christian girls were not on my radar screen. But in that particular group, there was a lady, her name was Cindy Ashermeyer, and she was engaged to be married, so there was nothing romantic. We happened to be working together in the chicken sheds, and for the first time in my life, I realised that Christians had a sense of humour. Christians could be fun. And so as a result, Cindy came back to the States. She told her fiancé and her parents about me, and lo and behold, so I was told later, they began to pray for me. This was 4265 Dogwood Avenue, Seal Beach, okay, because I was communicating with the family, the Ashermeyer family. And cut a long story short, the following year, before I went back to Israel for the second time, I came for a visit to here. I had a job all lined up in Las Vegas, so I decided I'd come here first, free accommodation for 3 weeks. They invited me, actually. And at the Ashermeyers, and again, they were obviously praying for me. We went to a concert at Anaheim Convention Center, and there was a man, you might have heard of him, called Keith Green. Okay, he was actually performing that day. They thought I was going to get zapped. I didn't. I couldn't wait to get out. And outside there was a big screen. And lots of people who couldn't get in were outside watching it. I was inside and I couldn't wait to get out. Okay? So this was 1980. Shortly afterwards, the job in Las Vegas didn't work out. Shortly later, I went back to Israel, continuing my quest to find the truth. I knew the truth was there. And that's when I made my quest to begin the process of Judaism, until I realized that it's all about religion, so I pulled out. When I pulled out of that in 1980, towards the end of 1980, or beginning of 81, when I pulled out of that process, I had nothing to fall back onto. There was no foundations in my life. And I really spiraled downwards, because I had a goal, and that was to become an Israeli. To converting to Judaism was it, and I didn't do it. So in that period of time, when I was down at the rock bottom, a Christian girl came to the kibbutz. Okay? Now guess where that Christian girl came from? Well, Los Angeles. I'm not quite sure if it was Orange County, but somewhere in greater Los Angeles. And she began to witness to me about Jesus. I wasn't interested in what she was saying about Jesus, because I said that if there is a God, he's the God of Israel and the Jewish people. You Christians are all hypocrites. And I didn't say it just like that. It was a bit more, with a bit more venom. This lady began to pray. And as a result, I actually got interested in this lady. Okay, it is not my wife, Lexi. Her name was Suzanne. And so, as a result of an interest in this particular Christian lady and some other volunteers, we went to Jerusalem for Passover and Easter of 1981. They fell on the same weekend. And I ended up at a place called the Garden Tomb in Jerusalem on Easter Sunday morning. There was an Anglican minister with a guy with a dog collar who was preaching. I didn't like people with dog collars because that was to do with religion. However, he preached a message which flip-flopped my entire life. For me, it had always been an either-or situation. Okay? Either the Jews were right, the Christians were wrong, or vice versa. I happened to think the Jews were right, and the Christians were wrong. There was no connection. This Anglican minister said Jesus is a Jew. Jesus is the Passover lamb. The return of the Jewish people to the land of Israel would precede the return of Jesus to Jerusalem. Bam, that was it. That was my epiphany. So whatever this lady had been witnessing to me, and what Cindy had been witnessing all those years, or several years before, somehow began to come together. And there was a combination of factors which led me in July 1981 to commit my life to being a follower of Jesus, and I had a very, very radical born-again experience. My life was turned upside down. I knew my life was back in Israel because this experience happened in London. I went back. I was only out of Israel a few months. I went back to Israel, and I began to volunteer in a hospital for handicapped Jewish and Arab adolescents. So now I had contact with Arabic-speaking people as well as Jewish. Shortly after that time, I went to work at another hospital as a nurse's aide. I had no medical background as a nurse's aide, and that hospital also had Holocaust survivors. There was a psychiatric ward, and most of it was geriatric, Lexi, my wife, was a nurse in that particular hospital. And part of my work as the helper of the physiotherapist was to go into the closed ward and help out with music and dance therapy. I never had any connection at all in my life to music or with dance. The next thing I know, I'm involved in this, and it was the closed ward. When I first went in, it was quite rather spooky. It really was. It was a closed ward. In that ward, there were many Holocaust survivors, and they were there, and a lot of them actually had survivor's guilt. And so I had more contact, therefore, with people who had survived the Holocaust. There'd been some on the kibbutz, but this was a bit different. You're actually rubbing shoulders in a very close way with people who were traumatized by the event. Now, living in Israel for 25, Lexi and I were married in 1984. It's now our 40th wedding anniversary, and that's part of the reason why I was able to get Lexi to come with me on this tour. She's never done that before, so I'm very blessed that Lexi could be with me. When you live in Israel, we lived in Israel for 25 years. Our 4 children were born there. When you live in Israel, you are constantly reminded of the Holocaust. It's there all the time by people you meet, but every year at Yom HaShoah, for 2 days, prior to Yom HaShoah, even on Yom HaShoah, on the television, there are documentaries about the Holocaust. It's a very somber, not day, it's a somber period of time because beforehand there's lots of exposure given to it. And even the daily reality of living in Israel, you are constantly reminded of the Holocaust. So for 25 years, I kept on having this involvement. My own work, in 1986, I got involved with the evangelical Anglican church called Christ Church inside the Old City. It's organised by an organisation called CMJ. And I worked there for 20 years in a whole different lot of capacities, but mostly as the local guide, because we always had lots of visitors, including lots of Israeli visitors would come. It's inside the Old City of Jerusalem. It's an historic building. The building is built to resemble a synagogue, for instance. Through that work, I began to get into the stuff I had loved as a kid, which was research and writing and speaking. And so even though not even having a BA, next thing I know, I'm actually writing publications and doing research at various universities, etc., etc. Again, when you do that sort of work, you come up against the Holocaust, okay? You're being confronted by the Holocaust, because anything to do with Israel, Israel's modern history, etc., the Holocaust is always there, either front or back. I won't go into any details about the majority, most of the research and writing I used to do in those days, but a lot of it had to do actually with why the Australians were in the Middle East, because I was majoring in the period of British and Protestant history in the land of Israel. And if you look at British history, of course, that's the First World War, Second World War. Australian soldiers were there as part of the British forces on both occasions. So now I actually had a bit of a context as to why my family members were in the Middle East. Back in Australia, I never got the context. Now in Israel, doing this work and this research, in the bigger picture, I could finally understand why we were there. So as a result of this, many, many different doors opened. And one of the most important doors that opened, I think, was into the research, the whole area of research. The Lord just gave me a gift. What else can I say? It's God's gift. But I needed to have that gift in order to do the work that I was doing, because I'm speaking to Israelis, academics, and you always have to have something fresh, a new angle, okay? So if you go to the primary sources and you get fresh information, the Israeli academics will listen. And that's what I began to find more and more. We left Israel in 2009. Our daughters, because we're Gentiles and our daughters were Gentiles, the religious didn't want us there, so each time my daughter turned 18, they lost their visa, so they had to leave and go back to Australia to study. And so we moved back to Australia in 2009, and I began to do more research in a whole range of different subjects. In 2018, the minister of Christ Church Jerusalem, a very close friend of mine called Reverend David Pelleggi, I was searching for a new research project. I just completed something very significant, which was 2017. 2017 was the 100th anniversary of the Battle of Beersheba and the 100th anniversary of the Balfour Declaration. I'll give you a bit of background history in that because Olivia touched on it. The land of Israel was under occupation by the Ottoman Turks. And it doesn't matter how big the Zionist organisation was, until the Ottoman Turks were defeated, you would have no Jewish restoration. Fact. Okay? So how were the Turks defeated? British, Australian and New Zealand soldiers. we're the ones who defeated the Turks in 1916, the Sinai 1917, the land of Israel 1918, the rest of the Syrian province, Turkish province of Syria. The key battle was the 31st of October 1918 at a town called Beersheba. Okay, and the key part of that particular battle was the charge of the Australian light horse, Australians on horses, and we were able to actually effect the final victory set up by the British and the New Zealanders, 31st of October 1917 at Beersheba. You all know about Beersheba, town associated with Abraham, Isaac and Jacob. At the same time, in London, the British War Committee was meeting, and they made a decision, 31st of October 1917, not the 2nd of November. Okay? 31st of October was when the British War Cabinet made the decision, which later became known as the Balfour Declaration. Okay? And so on the same day, two things were happening. One in the land of Israel, the defeat of the Ottoman Turks, or the beginning of the defeat. Secondly, in London, the decision that was made that the British would establish a Jewish national home in Palestine once it had been defeated, captured from the Ottoman Turks. Okay, so I'd been involved in this for 30-odd years, this research, and I developed tours, okay? And so in 1917, we had 100th anniversary events in Beersheba and in London at the Royal Albert Hall. I was involved in that. When it was finished, I was walking out of this place called the Royal Albert Hall, and I sensed the Lord just saying, "That's it, Kelvin, job done. Everything I've been involved in for 30-odd years of research and writing, that's it. Okay, what do I do now? I'm a researcher, basically." And shortly afterwards, David Pelleggi, Minister of Christchurch, Jerusalem, said, "Kelvin, I have some research projects for you." One of them was, what happened to the Jewish followers of Jesus during the Holocaust? And that was the only one that jumped off the page. What happened to the Jewish followers of Jesus during the Holocaust? We know that there were some. We know of names of Isaiah Feinstein, Johannes Rothenberg, okay, and others. But were they the only ones? Rachmiel Friedland, who later became a well-known Messianic pastor here in this country. Okay? He survived. And there are others. Ernest Casuto, we know of him. He wrote a book. Okay? But were they the only ones? Were there more? Yes, there were many, many more. So my research project was to find out as much as possible as to what happened to these Messianic believers, as we'd call them now. In those days, they were called Jewish Christians, Hebrew Christians, Mishumadim, traitors, okay, and just converts. And so the task now began. Now, I know that some others had done some research on the project. Rich Glazer, for instance, Richard Harvey from Jews for Jesus in the UK, you know, some others and also, but my task was now full-time to actually dig in and find as much as possible about this. Now, I don't know where I put my glasses, but before I get into the guts of the presentation, so that might give you some idea of why I'm up here today. I'd just like to read one scripture to set a context for this, from Hebrews chapter 11 into chapter 12. From verse 32, and what more can I say? For the time would fail to tell of Gideon and Barak and Samson and Yiftach, all of David and Samuel and the prophets, who through faith subdued kingdoms, worked righteousness, obtained promises, stopped the mouths of lions, quenched the violence of fire, escaped the edge of the sword, out of weakness were made strong, became valiant in battle, turned to fight the armies of the aliens. Women received their dead, raised to life again. Others were tortured, not accepting deliverance, and that they might obtain a better resurrection. Still others had trial of mockings and scourgings, yes, and of chains and imprisonment. They were stoned, they were sawn in two, they were tempted, were slain with the sword. They wandered about in sheepskins and goatskins, being destitute, afflicted, tormented, of whom the world was not worthy. They wandered in deserts and mountains and dens and caves of the earth. Now, putting this into the context of 1933, 1945, it could almost be a Shoah context, a Holocaust context, what has just been written. All of these, having obtained a good testimony through faith, did not receive the promise. God having provided something better for us, that they should not be made perfect apart from us. Chapter 12. Therefore, now this is a message in the sense of relating to us. Therefore we also, since we are surrounded by such a great cloud of witnesses, and I look upon those Yeshua-believing Jews, those Jewish people who follow Jesus, I look upon them as a witness, okay? A cloud of witnesses. Since we are surrounded by so great a cloud of witnesses, let us lay aside every weight and the sin which so easily ensnares us, and let us run with endurance the race that is set before us, looking unto Jesus, Yeshua, the author and finisher of our faith, who for the joy that was set before him endured the cross, despising the shame, and has sat down at the right hand of the throne of God. For consider him who endured such hostility from sinners against himself, lest you become weary and discouraged in your souls. And so anything to do with the Holocaust, folks, I don't need to tell most of you, you come from Jewish backgrounds, you've had much more experience than I have. Anything related to the Holocaust is very sad, depressing, dark. What good can there be? Unless we can see some light. And you don't need to have much light in the darkness for there to be light. So what's a light in the darkness of the Holocaust? Well, I believe it's those Jewish followers of Yeshua. I think they were a light. We have some testimonies of what they did, what happened to them, and how they were a light in a dark place. A lot of people on this subject get hung up on numbers. How many were there? Tens of thousands, hundreds of thousands? I don't think it's into the hundreds of thousands. It could have been. I don't get so involved in that, because I think it's important for us to look at some of the individuals and the impact some of the individuals had in that dark place, and realize that no matter how many there were, there's a very, very good chance that they were all lights in a dark place, shining in the midst of that darkness. So I just want to give a little bit of a background of several of these witnesses, Jewish followers of Jesus. Of course, the vast majority, we don't know their witness. We will know one day, but we don't know because they died, and so nothing was left. Much of our information comes from survivors who wrote later. But we do actually have some information from people who were there prior to them actually dying. I want to give a little bit of a background about how we've done this research project since the inception. I've done 5 research trips to the locations. The only 2 places I haven't managed to get to is Belarus and Ukraine. I was supposed to go there a couple of years ago, and a geopolitical event stopped me from going there. But the endeavour has always been to go to as many different places as possible to actually walk the ground where those events took place. You've got to do that because somehow or other you've got to get a feel for the big picture. As I explained in Denver a couple of days ago, many of us, Gentiles anyway, we see a dividing line there. We know about the Holocaust, okay, but you've got to step over the line sometimes and sort of get immersed in it as much as is possible. And I never was willing to do that until 2018. And it's a spooky place when you get over the line and get more involved, because you have to do a lot of reading, listen to a lot of testimonies, and sort of experience it as much as you can to get the feel. And for me, one of those areas of experiencing it was to go actually out into the ground, to actually go and locate locations and places. And some of those places, finding them as an individual person was a bit spooky as well. But as a researcher, in a sense, that's what you have to do. Now, we have a man here originally from France. So I'll tell you briefly about one of those adventures. There were 7 phases of the Holocaust. For me, I have worked out there were 7 phases of the Holocaust. And one of those phases actually has specifically to do with France. Or a lot to do with France. Because when you read through a lot of material, you can get immersed in the material. You've got to, in a sense, you've got to have an idea of the bigger picture, the Holocaust, before you begin to look at, well, what happened to the Jewish followers of Jesus? You have to understand the broader dynamics. And there's so much material. Look around you here now, and you realize there's a lot of material. Well, I had to get immersed in a lot more material than you see written around here, and I was getting lost. So I asked the Lord, please give me some idea of how I can actually break this down so I can comprehend the chronology of the Holocaust. And so I began to see there were 7 phases. Phase 1 was until 1933. I call it the origins of the Nazi worldview. What happened in European, German, worldwide society, which actually laid the foundation for the Nazi Party to come along with this plan to annihilate the Jewish people. Okay, so that was the beginnings of the Nazi worldview. The second period would have been 1933, where the Nazis came into power, and then they began to implement. Now, like probably many of you, I always had a thought the Nazis had the plan to murder the Jewish people from the beginning. It's actually not true. That came later. The idea initially was to make Germany judenfrei, okay, to get the Jewish people out of Germany and the wider Reich. And so in 1933 to 39, that's what they're actually endeavouring to do. Jewish people were killed, yes. Apart from Kristallnacht, there were not any great numbers of Jewish people in Germany who were killed, but the endeavour was to intimidate them, exploit them, and get them out of Germany. 1939 comes along, they invade Poland, a new dynamic. Now you've got 3 million Jewish people in Poland. What are we going to do with them? Jewish people were killed, yes. There were massacres and annihilations, yes, but they were very, very small compared to what happened later. There was no policy of genocide at this period of time. So the whole idea then was to put the Jewish people into ghettos and ultimately to move them to an area around the city of Lublin. And so Lublin would be a little Judea in the middle of Poland. So all those Jewish people would be moved to this area, about the size of Yorkshire. I don't know what state that would be, probably New Jersey or something. I don't know how big New Jersey is, but not as big as Texas. So all the Jewish people would be sent to this area. They'd be first taken to ghettos, then taken to the area around Lublin. This, in time, proved impracticable, and so they had to revamp. Now, in this stage, you've got Jewish people who were living in Germany and Austria and Czechoslovakia. Then you had the Jewish people now in Poland, okay, all under Nazi control. Then in 1940, they invaded the Netherlands, Belgium, and France. And so now you have about 550,000 more Jewish people. What are we going to do with them? And so that's when the idea came up of taking them all to the French colony of Madagascar. And so that was initially just the Jewish people from Western Europe, and then they began to work out the plans. You might have heard of a man called Adolf Eichmann, okay, and Thomas Dannecker from the Nazi Party. They then began to formulate a plan to take all these Jewish people to the island of Madagascar. How serious was it? Very serious. Okay? The Nazi hierarchy was involved. Hitler was aware of it and sanctioned it, and so too did the other leaders. Now, I'd never heard of this. When I started to do my research, in-depth research, I came across the testimony of a Jewish lady from Germany who had been picked up from the house alongside thousands of others, and instead of being sent to Auschwitz, okay, this is still 1940, okay, she wasn't sent to the east, she was sent to the west, and ended up by being sent to the southern part of France, to an area, the southern Pyrenees, and a little tiny area called Gurs, G-U-R-S. Well, this was all quite new to me. I may have heard of this in the past, but it never gelled. Now it did. I was fascinated. Why were they being sent to Gurs? Why were they being sent to southern France? Didn't make sense. 2 years later, they were all moved back again and then sent to Auschwitz. But in the meantime, why were they sent to this place? And that's when I began to realize more about this Madagascar plan. Yes, they would be sent to the island of Madagascar. But by now, it was not just the 550,000 Jewish people from Western Europe. It would be all the Jewish people then under Nazi control, which means 4 million. So 4 million Jewish people would be sent to the island of Madagascar. It became unworkable. Why? Because the British couldn't be defeated, and the British Navy controlled the waterways to the island of Madagascar. So what do we do? Then comes the next phase, when the Germans invaded invaded the Soviet Union. In June of 1941, Operation Barbarossa, and now you've got a lot more Jewish people there. Now, the Nazis actually had a particular methodology. They had murder squads called Einsatzgruppen, and there were certain groups of people. The Einsatzgruppen and the murder squads were to single out and to shoot, to murder, and amongst those were Jewish males of a certain age, because they were construed to be Bolsheviks. Okay, the whole false theology that Jews and Bolsheviks are together, and so now they could actually go out and shoot the Jewish males. And that was part of the policy. That's why in those days not many Jewish women and children were murdered. Mostly it was Jewish men. Until the end of July, when there was a particular letter which came from Hermann Göring down to Heydrich, and things changed thereafter because now the permission was given to actually begin to murder Jewish men, women, and children. So you can see that in the numbers, because these murder squads were giving numbers periodically back to the hierarchy, how many people they'd shot. We're talking about thousands, okay? And so suddenly women and children are actually being included in these numbers. Hadn't been the case so much previously. So now there was a change, okay? And so they now realise the policy for dealing with the Jewish problem was actually annihilation. Initially, this was in those conquered areas, Lithuania, Latvia, Estonia, Belarus, Ukraine primarily, where up to 2 million Jewish people were shot. It's called the Holocaust by bullets. Now, towards the end of 1941, we begin to see this morphing into the next phase, you might say, whereby people from Germany and other parts of the West were actually being transported to the Soviet Union on trains, taken off, and many occasions they were shot in forests nearby. So I've located some of those killing fields in Lithuania and Latvia particularly, and gone and visited them, and they were very daunting out in these forests with these areas of mass graves, etc. And a lot of those were Germans. In one particular place, they got big stones, huge stones around this memorial of all the towns in Germany where these people had come from. And I think there's about 250 or so big memorial stones out there in Lithuania of where these Jewish people had come from in Germany itself. So that gives you some idea that the policy was now going out further. And then the final phase began in January 1942 with what we call the Wannsee Conference, whereby it was actually decided that all 11 million Jewish people in Europe and surrounding areas would be murdered. When I say surrounding areas, it means areas that weren't under German occupation, so they would make alliances with different countries to either kill the Jewish people there or transport them to Europe. So those areas included the Middle East. So that is why the battles of North Africa that the British and the Australians and the New Zealanders and others fought were very, very important, especially the Battle of El Alamein, where my wife's cousin was killed in 1942. That's why they're so significant, because the Nazis, in their plans to capture the area, you might have heard of General Rommel, okay? So all part of that was because they would then begin the process of killing all 700,000 Jewish people who then lived in the Middle East, including 500,000 in the land of Israel. So the Germans were very serious about that. They actually established a specialized murder squad called an Einsatzkommando, and they would actually follow the German forces in, work with local collaborators, and begin the process of murdering the Jewish people who lived in the Middle East, including those in the land of Israel. Okay, so that also helped me to comprehend a bit more of the broader dynamic as to why Australians and New Zealanders were in that region, and also to understand the significance of their victory at the Battle of El Alamein in 1942. Most Australians, of course, and New Zealanders were completely oblivious to this other dynamic, and so that's why a lot of my work over the last number of years has been involved also with this educational process. So that gave me some idea about this particular dynamic. And of course, me being me, Lexi, my wife, knows how I'm wired, and I like to get out there and find the locations. And so this Madagascar plan and this place called Gurs, where this German Jewish lady who was a follower of Jesus was sent to, I was intrigued. I actually had to go and see it to see if it was true. I'd read about it, but is it really true? And so I made a big schlep on one of my speaking tours in France some years ago and went down and located this place called Gurs in the southern part of France, and it's there. Well, there's not much of it left, but the plaques are there, and they show you where these places are at. And there's a big cemetery, because the Jewish people were there for a year and a half or so. The big cemetery of all those Jewish people who died while they're there, and it's possibly the only place where Jewish victims of the Holocaust actually have their own individual gravestone. Okay, with the names and birth dates and where they came from. Quite impactful for me. So, within all that context, which helped me to comprehend the broader perspective, so I could better understand when a decision was made, when it was made, to then understand the ramifications that happened from it. Otherwise, it's just a lot of dates and data. So this helped me. And there is a little booklet out there called 7 Phases of the Holocaust. Perhaps it might help you as it's helped me. Also, when it came to the precise purpose of my research project, what happened to the Jewish followers of Jesus, HaShoah, then I began to read a lot of data, first of all on the internet, then with some books. You know, I had not a big library, but sufficiently big. And suddenly I realized I actually had some books in my library which I'd forgotten about. And bang, oh, I remember that one. So I want to tell you, when you want to do a research project, take along with you the best research assistant you could ever get. You know who he's called? The Holy Spirit. He is the best research assistant because he just illuminates things and gives you ideas of where to go and how to find it. And so I began to find materials. And I had one of Rachmiel Friedland's original little testimonies as well, which was written soon after the war when he came to the United States. On the internet then, began to do a lot of research on the internet as far as I could get. And then overseas, I came overseas and I've done, as I said, 5 research trips, most of those to actual locations. Last year I went to a place in eastern Romania, as far as east as you can get in Romania. It's a little town over there, or a city called Iași. And there'd been a thriving Jewish community there. There'd been a thriving Christian-Jewish community, Jewish-Christian community in this city, which was completely decimated in a terrible pogrom in June 1941. And the pastor for that congregation was a Jewish follower of Jesus called Isaiah Feinstein. And we have testimonies that he actually, in the death carriages and the carriages which led him to his death, he actually was testifying until he collapsed and died. So within that context of reading lots of material about the Jewish followers of Jesus, I also began to fall into, not a trap, but I began to think, well, there's lots of different names used here. Actually, before I do that, let me just go back to one of those research trips that I made. It was in 2018, and I went to, I think, 17 archives in 7 weeks in Britain, the US, and Canada. So, as you can imagine, there was a lot of schlepping around for that. And when I was in the States, I heard about a guy who lived down in San Diego. His name was David Rottenberg. I'd read a lot about his father, who was called Johann Rottenberg, who was a Dutch Reformed minister, who was also a victim of the Holocaust. He died in Mauthausen. And so I heard that the son was still alive, living in San Diego. So I was in Santa Barbara doing some research in the Bethel archives, and quickly made contact with David Rottenberg. He was then into his 90s. And I told him what research I was doing. He says, "Get down here." So I did. Caught a train down to San Diego. A friend picked me up, and next thing I know, I'm with this dear old gentleman, and he's telling us a lot about his father. He was there when his father was arrested by the Nazis. And his father had an incredible testimony. His father was Johann Rottenberg. I won't go into all the background details. If you aren't interested, the book out there on the Dutch Jewish Christians and the Holocaust goes into his story. But long and short of it was, he was arrested, okay, and then taken to a camp in Netherlands itself. Lexi, help me out. What was the name of the camp in the Netherlands where Rottenberg went to? Amersfoort, okay? And there's testimonies there that he was told not to do in his services because he was a pastor. Guess what he did? He was having services. And because of it, he was given extra special attention by the SS guards. You know what that basically means, okay? Didn't stop him testifying, okay? So we got witness accounts of that. Then he was sent to Dachau, and he misbehaved himself there as well. And so they said, well, we can't handle this guy here. So they sent him back to Holland briefly, and then they sent him to Mauthausen, which was a work camp, and very, very few people survived it, okay? The work was so terrible. Quarries and all sorts of things, and they were virtually worked to death. And here there weren't just Jewish people, there were others as well, but there was a large area of Jewish people. And so he died shortly after he arrived there, the Johann Rottenberg. And it's very interesting that his son told me, this backs up what you were saying earlier on, Olivia. The son said that this man was so unused to physical work, and now he's been made to do hard physical labor. That this man was so unused to physical labor, his son said he had perhaps a hammer in the house, and that was just to put up nails so that portraits could be put on. He had no other tools in the house. It's saying what you said earlier on. Okay, so can you imagine a guy like this? He was a scholar. The next thing you know, he's doing hard physical labor, and he died. Somebody was there, later wrote We've got the testimony from after the war that he led 1 to 2, I wasn't quite sure, at least 1, if not 2, led them to Jewish people to faith in Yeshua as Messiah before he died. Now, there could have been more, but if I know anything about the character of this man, from what I picked up from the historical documents, he would have been speaking of the Messiah right up until the day of his death. So, then you start looking at all this material, and there was quite a bit. But listen, there's a lot more material out there. There's more material than I'm able to research and find. So I'm hoping that other people, younger people, will pick up this burden, this vision, and take it even further. But I began to realize that lots of terms were being used for these Jewish people who followed Jesus, who followed Yeshua. As I said, they were called Jewish Christians, they were called Hebrew Christians, they were called converts, Mishumadim. Meches was another negative term in Polish. And a lot of them were just called the converts. And so I began to sort of realize that with all these different names out there, you could tell some of them, like Rottenberg and like Feinstein and others. Bazyli and Anna Jocz was another guy from Poland that I've written about what happened to the Polish Jewish Christians. There's one book out there, we're following the storyline of the Jocz family. Again, I was able to find, by the grace of God and the help of the Holy Spirit, original documentation about this particular person who died in Lvov. But there's so much information that I began to realize, were they all strong, born-again followers of Yeshua? Because some of the sources seem to indicate they weren't. Some indicate that they were. And so in time, I put together a little model, a research tool to help me, to be able to somehow put some of these people into different areas. So through that, I came up with a model, 7 groups of what the Nazis called non-Aryan Christians, or 7 groups of Jewish people who were associated with the church. Now that's the best definition I can personally come up with, who are associated with the church. Because some were obviously associated with the church for reasons of faith, many others were not necessarily associated with the church for reasons of personal faith. Now, so let me unpack that a little bit. You can look at the baptismal certificates, okay? You can look at those and all the baptismal records of the period pre-1939, and you can see there were hundreds of thousands of Jewish people throughout Europe who were baptized and became part of the church. Okay, so, but we don't know how many of those people had a definite heart experience, a definite heart conversion. So I've seen that there are 7 groupings. The first group would be those who are truly born again, if you want to use the words of Jesus to Nicodemus, truly born again of the Spirit in the period before the war began. And we know there were many. There were many, many Jewish people who came to faith in Yeshua, in Jesus, before the war began. That's one group. The second group would be what I call socio-economic converts. People who converted and were baptized in order to be able to get further in the host society. Because in many places you couldn't get particular jobs unless you converted and were part of the Roman Catholic Church or the Orthodox Church or the Lutheran Church or the Reformed Church. Okay? You had to be part of the host church before you got certain positions. And there are a lot of people in that category. Now, after they came to faith, after they went through the catechism, we don't know what happens in the hearts of those people. They could have suddenly realized, hey, listen, this makes sense. But it was a large group who came into the church through that particular way. That's the second group. The third one are those who converted and were baptized, I could say, in the shortened version, for love. Okay, you could say because of marriage. Okay, and so they were going to marry a Gentile spouse, and so they would actually convert and become part of the spouse's church. Now again, we don't know what happens in the hearts of those people during this process. The fourth category are the children and the grandchildren of those first 3 categories. Okay, so just because grandfather Yaakov or father Yitzhak became involved in the church 20 years before, 40 years before, it doesn't mean to say the child or the grandchild is actually going to follow in the faith. By that stage, they could be assimilated Germans, assimilated Austrians, assimilated Poles, could be going to church, may not know much about their Jewish background. Okay, for them, they're just ordinary Poles or Germans or Austrians. Some of those may have had a genuine faith, others possibly did not. So that fourth category is probably quite a large number. Then we get to the war itself, and we have three other particular groupings. One are those who converted and were baptized for physical survival. And we do know quite a bit of this happened, okay? So that people, there was a sympathetic minister or bishop, as far as in some cases, who was willing to actually baptize these people, give them a certificate so they could survive, escape and survive. Again, we don't know what happened in the hearts of most of those people in the process of doing the catechism, in the process of doing the conversion process. They also may have realized, hey, this actually makes sense. I want to become a true follower of Jesus. We don't know that. Another group will be children, and there are quite a few children who were put into the homes of Christian families or into institutions by the parents to survive. And here again, in order for those children to assimilate and to survive and be hidden in a sense, they had to go through those various processes to make them into proper Catholics or Orthodox or Lutherans or whatever. And the seventh group are those who had a genuine experience, a genuine born-again experience with the Lord during the war. And I'm pretty sure there were quite a few people who fell into that category. Some of those may have survived, some may not. We do have evidence from several who did survive that this was actually the case. Ernest Cassuto, for instance, wrote a book that's called The Last Jew in Rotterdam. And I actually was blessed to have his testimony from before he actually put the book together, so from way, way, way back. And that's a story of a man who came to faith in Yeshua as Messiah in the Netherlands. It's very interesting. He's an ordinary secular Jewish person in the Netherlands, most were. He had no idea at all what it meant to be a Jewish person. He's been told, as a Jew, you can't go here, you can't go there, you can't do this, you can't do that. So he realized, and he had a fiancée called Hetty. He realized, well, I better understand what it means to be a Jew. If I'm told I can't do this and I can't do that, I better know what it means to be Jewish. In the process of beginning this educational process of learning what it means to be Jewish, he happened to go along to a prayer meeting, a Bible study led by Johannes Rothenberg. And he was confronted with the reality of the Jewishness of Jesus. And he asked a question or two of the Dutch Reform minister, and the Dutch Reform minister gave him a few things to read next time round. Might have been a few meetings later. He was convinced in his own heart that Jesus was the Jewish Messiah. It's a very interesting story. Unfortunately, Hetty they then had to go to hiding when the deportation notices came out, because I think what I actually missed when I was going through my 7 phases, phase 7 was the Wannsee Conference. The Wannsee Conference of January 1942, which was the 7th of those phases. The Wannsee Conference determined that all 11 million Jewish people would be murdered, and that kicked into gear soon afterwards. And so the various countries then began to organize how are they going to deport all the Jewish people. And in the Netherlands, it began in July 1942. And so thereafter, Jewish people who were aware of it went into hiding. And those who either didn't believe or were not really aware of it, they were then deported. Okay, and so Cassuto and his fiancée went into hiding, and she was discovered, and she was sent off to her death. So Cassuto is one example. He later married another lady called Ellie Rodriguez, who as a child had come to faith in Yeshua as Messiah during the war. Okay, and so they later were married and came here to this country. So that's just a couple of examples. There are other examples as well. And so there you have this broader perspective. Some of the interesting stories relating to the Holocaust and what happened to the Jewish followers of Jesus, as I said, have been given to us by survivors. And one of the testimonies is a guy called Ludwig Hirschfeld. So I need to delve into what happened within the Catholic Church, because most of the Jewish people who were involved in the church were not in the Protestant Church. Okay, there was lots, but most of them were actually involved with the Roman Catholic Church. And Ludwig Hirschfeld was a typical assimilated Jewish person in Poland. He was converted and became part of the Catholic Church so he could actually further his position in society. He became a great professor But one day in 1942, there was a knock on his door. He's in Poland, he's in Warsaw. Knock on the door. Professor Hirschfeld. No, they wouldn't have said Professor Hirschfeld. They said, hey, you, Hirschfeld, out of here. We're going somewhere. Where are we going? To the ghetto, basically, is what he was told by the SS or the German soldiers. Why? You're a Jew. But he hadn't been part of the Jewish community for 20 or so years. Had never really functioned. Okay, been part of an assimilated Roman Catholic. But no, didn't make any difference. When that knock on the door came, he was a Jew. And so he began to put a few things together, and outside the case fell open and a book fell out. And the book was in German. So the German soldier says, hey, what are you doing with that? He said, well, I actually wrote that when I was a student in Heidelberg, or when I was working in Heidelberg. And the German soldier said, but now you are just a Jew. Doesn't matter what his background had been. Doesn't matter if he was part of the Roman Catholic Church. Now he was just a Jew. And so he was sent off, and together there were at least 4,000 Jewish Catholics in the Warsaw ghetto. There were some Protestants, because CMJ had to work in Warsaw. They had a thriving congregation of about 130, at least 130 adults, Jewish adults in the Polish congregation in Warsaw. So of that 130 or so, I think I found evidence of possibly 10, 15 max survived. So the rest, they're all Jewish followers of Yeshua, of Jesus. They were killed. And so those in that stage were sent to the Warsaw ghetto, so was Professor Hirschberg, and they managed ultimately to get him out. But he actually wrote in his testimony that he didn't know what it meant to be a Catholic or to be a Christian until he actually was in the ghetto, because he was confronted with this reality. The Jewish people saw him as a convert, okay, so you better understand a bit about what it means to actually be a Catholic Christian. And he also testifies that quite a few younger Jewish people then were coming and were being baptized. Okay, so from within those testimonies that you do have, you see little glimpses. And if you multiply the glimpses, you probably realize, well, those little lights were shining all over the place. Edith Stein, okay, was a German Jewish lady who came to faith in Yeshua in the 1920s in Jesus and was part of the Catholic Church. She was a very, very well-known academic, but she lost a job with the Arian paragraph in 1933 because she's Jewish and she was in a teaching position. You can't teach anymore, she was told. But she's in the Catholic Church. No, you're Jewish. Your bloodline says you're Jewish. And so she was ousted and ultimately went to the Netherlands, and she was in a convent in the Netherlands until the Germans invaded the Netherlands in 1940, until the Wannsee Conference 1942, and then it was agreed that all Jewish people in the Netherlands would be deported east to work camps in the east. So at this stage, the deportations were going to start on the 15th of July. And the Roman Catholic Archbishop of the Netherlands, Johannes de Jong, stood up and said, no, we're not allowing you to take any of our Jewish people. This is the Roman Catholic folks. We're not allowing you to take any of our Jewish people. He stood up not just for the Jewish Catholics, he was standing up for all the Jewish people. And the Nazi commander, Seyss Inquart, said, we'll show you who's boss. We'll tell you who makes the decisions around here. So he made a decision to immediately arrest all the Jewish Catholics and send them off. Edith Stein was one of those. And there is testimony from people who said, and I think it was her they wrote that her face was shining like an angel, and she was able to be a witness in that terribly dark place. Sent off on the 7th of August from Westerbork, 9th of August, arrived in Auschwitz, died within an hour or so later. And 113 Jewish Catholics in the Netherlands were all taken away in that same time and were killed. Others were killed later on. And so, again, a testimony. But for me, Archbishop Johannes de Jong, it was difficult for him afterwards when he had to wrestle with the implications of his decision, but it was a bold decision. So some of those testimonies, as I said, have been recorded for us, but I'm sure there were many, many more. A lot of people, as I said before, want to know the numbers. I've done some research in the Netherlands and in Belgium, 2 countries where they had the registration forms. The registration forms were every Jewish person. The children, of course, would be registered by their parents, but every Jewish person had to write a registration form. In that registration form, with their addresses and everything else, so later the Nazis knew where every Jewish person was. And in those registration forms, there was one little designation, religion. Would have been Dienst in Dutch, Lexi? Yep. So they could put they were Israelite, Orthodox, atheist, whatever they want to put up there. None. Someone said none, no religious. But someone writing Rooms-Katholiek, Roman Catholic, Orthodox, a few of them, but mostly Reformed, Dutch Reformed, or whatever else. So those forms were there, and so it actually has information about those Jewish people who identified as being part of the church. A German official in 1942 went through all those 104,000 forms, took out those who actually had put themselves down as being part of the church. They were then written up in a booklet. I read about the existence of this booklet. So, being a pseudo researcher, you need to find the primary source, because this would give evidence of how many of those Jewish people in the Netherlands identified as being part of the church, and from that we could actually work out how many of those actually were murdered in the Holocaust. So it was a big, lengthy process. With the help of my Dutch sister-in-law, Lexi's twin sister, we actually tracked down that little booklet. It took a long time to find it, but we finally found it in an archive in the Netherlands. 1,881 names. We weren't allowed to photocopy the booklet. It was 32 pages. We weren't allowed to photograph it. Everything had to be typed out by hand. Okay, all the seven different categories. So that was all done. It took a number of days to do it. At the end of that, back home, I had a book that big, which was about all the 104,000 Jewish people who died in the Holocaust. I then had to cross-reference all those 1,881 names of those who identified as being part of the church with the records of those from the Netherlands who died in the Holocaust. And that took up a week or three. And so from that, I then began to realize that here was the evidence, okay, the hard evidence of those Jewish people in the Netherlands who died. And it was about 430. I say about because the numbers obviously will change. Could change because we don't know afterwards who confessed faith in Jesus whose name wasn't in that particular list. So that gives you some idea. How many of those 430 were true, born-again Jewish followers of Jesus? I don't know. And I don't think we ever will know. We don't know what happens in the hearts of people. We don't know what happened in the hearts of many others who were going to the deaths either. But at least that's some hard-core evidence to start with. Then Belgium, and I'll finish up on this. With Belgium, no Nazi official had gone and actually filtered out all those names. I knew there were the registration forms and the Holocaust archive in the Netherlands, in Belgium. So I went there and I spent 9 solid days. I went there twice, but the second time around, 9 solid days, working through 45,000 registration forms. Some of those were 2 or 3 pages, so I think I worked it out 102,000 pieces of paper in 9 days. And again, going through those forms, working out all those who said they were part of the church, had to write their details down, and then go through the whole process again. And it came down to about 80 names that we have evidence of that actually died in the Holocaust. Same thing, we don't know how many of those were assimilated. We don't know how many of those were true followers of the Lord. But does it really matter that much? In one sense, does it really matter that much? Because the fact of the matter is, with the little that we know there were lights in the darkness. How many lights are there in the Holocaust? It's dark, people. It's the darkest episode in human history. But we know that within the darkness, there were these small lights that were shining. Isaiah Feinstein, Bazyli Jocz up in Lvov, Johannes Rothenberg, Edith Stein, and many, many others besides. So what is the purpose of doing this? Is it just to find the numbers? No, because I honestly do not believe we'll ever know the exact numbers. It's not the numbers. It's the fact that we know that in a dark place, lights shone. And it's our responsibility as followers of Yeshua. Many of you are Jewish. I'm a Gentile background believer. But the Lord has somehow placed this burden upon my heart. It's our responsibility to do what we can to allow their testimony, the testimony of these witnesses, to shine forth. The other thing is, it's a testimony for us today. Folks, we're in a dark period today as well. It's getting darker. Here's some hope. That in those dark places, then, little lights shone. What's the responsibility for me and for you? It's to be a little light today. And if we're all little lights, then together that's a big light. And I think that's one of the most important things for us to remember. It's a great challenge. As I've done this research, I often have thought, what would I have done if I was in the same situation back then? You know, we'd like to think that we'd be really holy and zealous and courageous. I wouldn't have done that. I would have hid those people. I wouldn't have given them up. But folks, to be honest, I don't know how I would have reacted if I was on the spot at the time. I don't know. You know, I would hope that if I was there, I would act in a godly way. But what would you do? What would any of us do when we're in that situation? We can't be pious about this because we honestly don't know what's going to happen. So, the challenge for us is to pray and say, Lord, if and when darkness descends again upon the world, Lord, let our testimony shine forth. Let us be like an Isaiah Feinstein, a Johann Rothenberg, an Edith Stein, or a Bazyli and Anna Jocz, or anybody else. I think that is the most important thing that we can learn from this. Would it be, dear Lord, that you would have us, Father God, in times of trial and temptation? Would it be, Lord, that you would have us to be those lights that are shining in the darkness? And Father, our great desire is that, Lord, many, many Jewish people would come to faith in Yeshua as Mashiach, Lord, in this time. As many, many more Jewish people today than 6 months ago are beginning to feel constricted, restricted, are beginning to feel fearful, Lord, we pray, Father God, that many of those Jewish people today would turn to Yeshua, would seek for the light in the darkness, and would come to know him who is the true light shining in the darkness. Lord, I ask and pray this in Yeshua's mighty name. Amen.